Hey, welcome to the MasterYourMix podcast. My name is Mike Indovina, and thanks for hanging out with me today. Today, my guest is Scott Wiley, and if you're not familiar with Scott, Scott is a producer, recording engineer, mix engineer, and studio owner. He runs a amazing, beautiful-looking space based out of Provo, Utah, called June Audio Recording Studio. And that studio, they've had the chance to work with artists like Neon Trees, National Parks, Post Malone, John Legend, and a whole bunch more. And in today's conversation, we get into a lot around the topic of just simply asking yourself, does it sound good? It's a powerful question that I think often we don't ask ourselves enough. You know, it's so easy to get lost in gear selection and processes and all that kind of stuff. And yeah, all of that stuff is important. But at the end of the day, it all comes down to that question of, does it sound good? Because if it is good, it is good, you know? And so with that said, we talk a lot about Scott's journey of engineering and being a studio owner, then going to being an assistant, and then getting back into running a studio again. And, you know, a lot of the lessons he's learned along the way. But throughout that journey, a lot of the biggest lessons he's learned have come back down to that one question. Yeah, we get into the idea of picking the right gear for the job in the studio in this episode. We get into the idea of capturing great performances and how to get something that feels authentic, how to get people feeling inspired when they get in the studio. All of that stuff is important. But at the end of the day, we always have to remind ourselves of that question. Does it sound good? In this interview, we definitely dive deeper into understanding the nuances of that question and understanding what to do when things don't sound good. That's just as important, right? It's not about everything always sounding good. Sometimes you're going to run into scenarios where things don't. What do you do then? So yeah, we get into that in this interview today. We also dive into his mixing process as well. And we talk a lot about the idea of creating separation in the mix. And Scott talks a lot about the idea of mixing while you're recording and how a lot of things like separation and the clarity that you're shooting for in a mix, that's stuff that doesn't necessarily happen in a mix. Yeah, you can get close to that in the mix, but it's going to be so heavily dependent on the recording stage too. So yeah, we get into Scott's philosophies on that and a lot of the processes that he follows to make sure that he's creating that separation and getting that balance and making his mixes feel big and clean. So yeah, I think that this is a really awesome episode. There's tons of great stuff to take away from this. So with that said, let's just jump right into it. Scott Wiley, thank you so much for being on the MasterYourMix podcast. How's it going today, man?
It's good. Thank you for having me, Mike.
Of course. For people who might not know you or aren't familiar with, you know, who you are, what you do, and all the cool stuff that you're working on these days, can you give us that background?
Sure. Well, I am an audio engineer, producer, probably primarily at this point a studio owner. I live in Provo, Utah. I grew up in Southern California, worked there during high school in some smaller studios, worked there during college. I went to USC and studied music recording and did my 4 years there. After college and living in Southern California for so long, I kind of wanted to move somewhere, and I moved to Utah, kind of following some friends that went to school, and just, I don't know, it's a cool place, it's nice. And worked here for a while, started a studio after working in a number of other studios, and then after a while felt like, okay, well, you know, maybe in order to progress in my career, I need to move back to LA. So my wife and I moved back, worked there another, I want to say like 9 or 10 years, and then kind of found that the lifestyle was not really for me, and so moved back here. And about 6 years ago, opened a kind of a larger version of my studio, which is called June Audio.
Awesome. I mean, it's interesting to hear you talk about like going back and forth. And I think that a lot of people still have this idea that like to be successful in the music industry, you need to live in that major music hub city. And LA obviously is one of those places. So, you know, making that move from LA, did you feel like it made a big impact as far as like clients and workload? Or at that point, do you feel like you had established yourself enough that the transition didn't matter?
Well, when I moved from here, I had been working for a long time, for I don't know how long, 15 or so years, or maybe longer, given high school. And when I moved back, I was a studio owner here, went back and began again as a runner. Or not, I guess I skipped the runner stage and went to assistant. But I was assistant engineer in LA for a long time, kind of again, because I was starting over. I feel like I was able to kind of move quicker because I had had so much experience, but I also really appreciated the the ability to assist people and get to see a lot of people rather than kind of being the guy. And when I moved back, or even when I was living there and coming back, just the idea that, oh, this guy's coming from LA did probably help me career-wise around here. Although the truth is, I don't know that should necessarily add up to anything. It doesn't necessarily mean you're really good or you're, or bad. But when I moved from here back to LA and started working with a lot of great engineers and watching them work, I did feel like I learned so much quickly after kind of working on my own in my own studio for years. It was great to see some other ways of working and also just kind of appreciate the similarities in what we're doing here versus somewhere like LA and the differences, which were they were interesting. I mean, an example, I was very careful with like signal flow, especially with compression and stuff, working on my own here, and kind of had things from school, and things from reading online on Gearspace and other things where, you can get, I was getting safe, don't hit that compressor more than like 3 dB on the way into, Pro Tools or whatever you're recording to, and be careful with this, be careful with that. Those are great rules to have if you don't want to end up in a bad way, Sometimes you can overdo things and it's hard to undo. But when I went to LA, I remember being an assistant and working with a great engineer, and I kind of was alerting him, from the back of the control room, hey, that compressor's really getting slammed, thinking he would want that. He wasn't upset or anything, but he did say, well, I said, that's getting hit pretty hard. Maybe you didn't notice, And he said, well, how's it sound? And I said, oh, well, it sounds cool. And he's like, well, who cares then? And that was a big lesson, that's a big lesson. How does it sound? Stop looking, If I've done a lot of live kind of albums, live recordings, both in terms of the style that was popular around here for a while, which was kind of singer-songwriter and also saving money. And in those cases, sometimes I like to be safe with compression and things on the way in, because you never know what's going to happen. And sometimes that there's a place for that for sure. But that was a big thing to learn and to kind of open up my mind to the idea that, I had been playing it safe. The other thing I really learned watching people work in LA and in contrast to here was just this notion of, if you're working on a track that's supposed to sound like somebody's going for it, it's not volume. They have to be going for it, They got to dig into that acoustic guitar. It doesn't matter if I can turn it up all day long. If they're playing light, it sounds light. And I've always, when I talk to bands, I kind of equate it to this idea that when you're taking a picture, we've all seen pictures of ourselves where we're really smiling or where we're smiling because somebody said to smile. And you can tell the difference, even though, they both should be the same. You can really hear a difference when somebody's going for something on their instrument or in their vocal or recording or whatever versus just something that's turned up louder, And I watched producers constantly tell acoustic guitar players especially, hey, you got to dig into that thing more. You got to play it harder, And that's, of course, in cases where it's supposed to sound that way. But there's no plug-in that makes up for that kind of thing.
For sure. No, I love that. I think that's a great example too of like the picture, because you could definitely, like, you feel something, you react to it differently because you can see the genuine nature of the smile when you see someone smiling in a photo for real. And it is the same thing. It's convincing when someone actually is performing it properly as opposed to being like kind of faking their way through it, right?
It totally is. And working around here and primarily working with local regional bands, we get the chance to work with bigger acts sometimes too, but work with a lot of regional and smaller bands. When bands come in, it's difficult to convince them to be artists. I think sometimes for some people it feels a little like they're putting it on, like they don't want to be as artistic as they should be. because they feel like they haven't earned it, or they're not at that place yet, or it feels kind of, I don't know, uppy about, I don't know, but we've designed this place, both the way it looks and hopefully the way it feels, to feel like a place where you're supposed to be artistic. And I often talk with bands and artists who are kind of lamenting the fact that their previous recordings haven't captured this live energy, and we love playing live and people love it, and then we record and it doesn't. And I think so much of it is this like idea of like, you got to perform it. Like, we're not in a lab, at least hopefully you're not, you can get away from viewing it that way. I tell people a lot, like when I've played shows, you play 10 songs in a show, let's say, and 2 of them are going to hit just right. Hopefully 10, but usually it's 2 or 3 that really happen that night, And what we want here in the studio is for those 2 to be the ones that we're recording. And so that, there ends up being a lot, as a producer, a lot of telling artists, like, maybe today's not the day for that. Don't get frustrated. You can do it, but that wasn't the performance. Yes, it was in tune, or yes, the timing was pretty good, but like, we're looking for something that's going to come through the photo and look like a real smile,
For sure. No, it's interesting. I feel like with what you said, there's probably some sort of like overlap there of like your experience with being too safe with your process, but also like the whole thing about musicians coming into the studio and playing it too safe too. And I wonder too if like some of that has to do with the fact that maybe they have their own home studio setups and stuff like that. And maybe they're not, like they're used to their own process, and maybe at home they can't, belt it out loud because I got neighbors or something like that, or like maybe they're just comfortable with their own process. It is pretty interesting. And yeah, I think that the performance is definitely the thing that is going to convince people if it sounds genuine, and you have to double down on that. And I love that you make such an effort to get that out of artists, as opposed to what a lot of people might do, which is just like capture it as it is and edit in post if you can.
And that we do, I'm sure we do plenty of that as well. Given the luxury of time, we're always trying to work for getting the best performance and giving up anything else that gets in the way of it. I mean, I remember doing a live record. Gosh, I'm going to forget who it was. Oh, it was a live, really fun record by a woman named Sadie Price. And I think it's still online. There was some problems with it in the label, and it went away for a while. But anyways, we did this live record where we just brought in a crew of musicians, and in a lot of cases, people played instruments that weren't really their main instrument. It was really like, we were constantly kind of saying like, what can we do here that's really surprising, that's really unusual, and that ended up with a lot of, the piano player playing guitar and the guitar player playing drums kind of things. But when I got, it was one of those records where it was all live, so it must have been 10 guys playing, and then she was playing and singing live, everything. And so we did a big setup the day before and patched everything, mics on everything, and trying to make it really flexible. Anyways, everything had compression set up, the whole thing. And when we got done with the record, I realized I hadn't even ever clicked any of the compressors out of bypass. Like, they were all in the chain, ready to go, but I never had taken the time to even turn them on, essentially. And, it was just funny to me because I went through a lot of thinking and picking just the right thing for everything. And then the moment happened and people are playing and we just hit roll and I never got back to it, And a great example of like, well, who cares? It sounded great, It
sounded good, yeah.
It was a cool record, and okay, we had all these expensive compressors patched in and we never used any of them. That's all right.
Well, I guess that's also just, again, like going back to like being used to a certain workflow, right? And you having probably the certain compressors that you like on certain instruments, and just like naturally your brain is like determined to just go through that process, right? And so whether you need it or not, maybe sometimes you get in that habit, right? So, but again, it all comes down to the sonics. So if that's what, if in your head it sounded great, then who cares what the settings were, right?
I worked with probably one of the biggest learning things of my career was getting to work on a few albums with Tchad Blake. And he was both producing and engineering and in different roles on the different albums that I got to work with him. But I went into that process being a big fan of Tchad Blake and the records that he had done with Mitchell Froom. And I loved his sonic, like the world he put together. And so I was really excited to get to work with him. And one thing about Tchad Blake that kind of gets to, at least at the time, got to the front, and this would have been pretty well before the internet as part of our regular daily lives. So a lot of reading magazines and whatever I could get my hands on. But what came out about Tchad Blake a lot was, he uses Sans amps on everything, and he uses the Shure level locks, and he uses Spectrasonic 610s and things. And so in my mind, I had formed this thing that was, Tchad Blake has this cool sound because of the gear that he has, So then I go in to work with Tchad, and sure enough, he's got the Sans amps and he's got the level locks and all the things. But immediately I realize, this guy's just an unbelievably great engineer. And that Sans amp is a cool texture, and that level lock does a cool thing. But I couldn't take those things and do what Tchad does. He has an unbelievable ear. I remember working with him, and I was his assistant, so he was saying, "Hey, we got to do this acoustic guitar," or whatever it was. I think it was on a Bonnie Raitt record. And I said, "Okay, great. What do you want?" And we were at Sunset Sound Factory, so we had a great mic locker. What do you want on it? Thinking, let's grab a C12, let's grab a 67, whatever. He had all the options. And I remember he just said, "Well, what's nearby?" And I said, there's like a talkback mic, like a 57 there, and there's something else. He said, "That's fine." And, I just grabbed whatever was nearby because he was like, "Hey, performance is about to happen. Let's get this captured. Well, I'm good. I'll work with whatever's there." And sure enough, he did, and did that over and over and over and over again. And really a great learning thing that was like, man, it's so awesome to have all this gear, and I'm just a crazy gearhead like everybody, many people are, and can get all wrapped up in it. But boy, it's all about your ears, how you interpret things, and just about anything can make a great record. This is a great studio. It's really easy to work in. It sounds great. But I tell bands all the time, you could make a fantastic record in your bedroom. And you absolutely can. And you can make a great record with that 57 or that SM7 or whatever. And sometimes it's just about learning how to work with it. And one thing I've done is a lot of learning how to work with things.
For sure. Of course. Well, you mentioned earlier that idea of kind of being too safe with your process. And when you went to LA, you were learning different ways of approaching things, and maybe kind of undoing some of the rules that you learned, whether it was through school or online, whatever. What would you say were some of those biggest rules that you learned and then you learned to undo?
Sure. I mean, a big one was in gain structure. It's funny because I am a big, not believer. It seems silly. It's like believing in gravity, but I am pretty adamant about my gain structure and making sure gain structure is right, and being careful with that, and yet sometimes I'll have somebody come in with such a cool sound, and I find out that they did it all backwards than what I learned in school, and so or I have people ask me. A lot of times in a band, there's going to be one guy who's really into recording, and he's in here and he's checking things out and trying to figure out what we're doing. And so there's a lot of questions about, are you compressing to Pro Tools, to tape, whatever? And I'm like, yeah, I want it to sound like I want it to sound as soon as possible. But that's another thing that you can pick up from school when you're young and you're trying to hear what are the important things? Well, be very careful compressing to tape, be very careful with gain structure. All those things are really correct sometimes, and sometimes you got to blow them up, And there's so many things like that. This mic is great for this, but not for that. And I was in a band in during college, and we were making a record with an engineer who was a really great engineer, but I was a young budding engineer thinking, well, I know, how to do this too. And I remember he was using 57s on acoustic guitars, and I was just like, that's outrageous. You use 57 on an acoustic guitar, you got to use this mic or this mic. And that was all things that I had either learned in school or from doing too much reading Mix magazine, you got to get a C12 or you got to get a whatever, small diaphragm, this or that. And sure enough, here these days, I'm using 57s on acoustic guitars all the time. But, I'm doing it because I know that, in this track, I kind of got to limit the dynamic range and the high end on this acoustic guitar. I want it to slot into this spot, and a 57's a great way to do that, But at the time, I was like, I don't know who you learned from, but this isn't right.
Totally. Yeah, I think a lot of times we mistake best practices for rules that are hard-lined and you can't change that. But when you see it as this generally works as a good practice, but there are times when the exception is the better choice. Once you start viewing it that way, I think it really opens up your eyes to what's truly possible and what actually matters, right?
Sure. Yeah, for sure. And it's so great to know those rules, and then it's so important to remind yourself that whose rules are they? What rules,
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think I have a pretty similar story to yours of going into a studio. I remember my first session outside of college, the engineer was like, oh, cool, you went to school? Forget everything you learned in school because now we're in the real world. We do things differently. And yeah, sure enough, it was in school we were told, don't clip your mic pre or don't use condenser mics on drums because you're going to break the mics, right? And then sure enough, that first session, it's all condenser mics on drums and
right.
hard pinning the Neves and everything. And it had a cool sound to it. And I was like, oh shit, this sounds way better than I thought it should, and it worked. So yeah, sometimes you just have to know the rules to be able to break the rules and just experiment with it until you get to know what you can and can't get away with, I guess, right?
Yeah. We've had the chance to work with the Killers and with Brandon Flowers quite a bit, and I would imagine that I'm okay sharing this, but Brandon's been working on kind of a solo project for a number of years, and he's brought in Sean Everett a number of times. And I know Sean's name from a lot of albums that I really like, and a lot of albums that are, the Casey Musgraves Golden Hour record that he mixed. What a beautiful sounding record. It's really a lovely sounding record. And in listening to it, I would have thought somebody was very careful with this record. Everything was very safe. This is very pure sounding. I don't know anything about how he mixed it, but I know about the processes I've seen him do from getting sessions from him and opening things up and having the chance to talk to him. And he breaks every rule that I think that my brain tells me to do, and also manages to make things sound beautiful and big and clean and dirty when needed, all the things. I don't know how he does it. I really don't. He has a way of interpreting things. His art he comes at things in his way, and that's why his records sound like his records. And it's remarkable to see and wonderful to see again, even being here in Utah, having the chance to have somebody like that come in and just go, wow, yeah, whatever he's doing works so great, and you got to just give it to him. I'm not going to go try to copy his EQ curves or something. It would never work for me, and it doesn't work. It one of the things that makes this job so hard to teach, and also probably why it takes so long to learn, is that it's I don't know how to tell you to. I literally don't know how to tell you to EQ that guitar. I listen to the guitar and I go, this sounds weird, and I EQ it some way, but I don't know why. I know that if I go back and analyze it, I might learn some things about why I did it, but I don't know. When it gets to my ears, it sounds like this, and I react.
Well, I think everything is just based on your personal taste, right? So the EQ curves from one engineer to another are going to change based on what they think is pleasing to their own tastes, right? So, but yeah, I think understanding taste is a very hard thing to learn and develop because yeah, you're going to see a lot of people doing it a certain way. And there's probably a lot that you can distill from that. And, there's going to be certain characteristics of sound that you're always going to hear in certain frequency ranges and all that. But it's like, once you know that, you have to be able to translate that to, well, what matters to me? Like, what am I hearing? Do I want more low end? Do I want more mid range or whatever? And then that's going to determine what moves you make, right? So, yeah, it's always that fine line of like connecting technical with personal taste.
Totally.
Yeah. You talked about how like, that idea of not really getting caught up too much in the gear that you choose and like grabbing a 57 because that's the closest thing. But one thing I'm curious to ask about is like, I know at your studio, you have like, I was talking about this earlier with you, but like you have one of the most beautiful gear rooms I've ever seen. Like it, right. It looks like you're walking into like a Guitar Center showroom or something like that, just the way you've got it all laid out with all the various drum kits and guitars and synths and stuff like that. It's beautiful. And anyone listening to this, go check out their website. Like it's amazing. But I'm curious to know, like, obviously choosing the right gear for the project is really important, and you have a lot of gear at your fingertips. So when it comes to picking gear for the job and when you're in the middle of a session, like how much time are you actually spending like auditioning things and trying to find the right instrument for the recording?
Well, we work on band. We have young bands come in and do an album in a day, and then I just got done with a project that was like a full month. And isn't even done yet, but a full month is a lot for around here, especially, and a lot for an independent band. In terms of something like that, like with this band, we were doing a lot of auditioning. We were doing a lot of, certainly we would change mics on the drum kit. I do a lot of changing out overheads, do a lot of changing out bass drums and snare drums. Toms, not a whole lot, it might tape them up, not tape them up, that kind of thing. But kick drum and snare drum get changed a lot. And guitar amps, pedals, guitars. When we have time, I always think like the first thing in the chain is the most important thing in my mind. So that's why, we have this crazy gear room that to some extent, it's grown crazy because I love all the stuff so much. But working as an assistant for other albums and albums that had bigger budgets, I saw a number of things come through over and over again, right? So it seemed like every producer had their Silvertone 1482, like a little 112 amp. Just as like every guy brought in one of those. And then you start like listening to it on different styles of music and you think like, well, this is a really versatile little amp, and you look into it and you go, this is $300, like this is like an old amp they're more now, but at the time I was like, I'm going to buy one of these, like it seems like this is a useful piece. And so I started collecting things that way, thinking like, well, I see every producer has this pedal, or a lot of producers are using this mic. And so then I'm trying to explore like, why is that? How would that help me? When I moved back from LA to here, part of the reason why I built my own studio, because my dream is not to own a studio. My dream is to produce and work on albums. But I didn't really find a lot of studios that had what I was hoping they would have in terms of like a space that sounded really great for live, for acoustic instruments, certainly a lot of the gear. And then you start working with younger bands and everybody's got like, a Squier Strat, or, in the best circumstance, a guitar player has one guitar and a drummer has one kit. But knowing as an engineer that like, man, I don't want to have to like EQ this snare drum a ton. Why don't we just grab another snare drum? And being in a place where you can still find cool instruments, like every once in a while, I just kind of started hunting for things. And I've got a whole wall in that gear room that's pretty much dedicated to like Ks and Silvertones and harmonies. And man, these instruments are so awesome recording. And I wouldn't dare take one of them and try to play it live. I know there are people that do, but man, they kind of keep those things in tune for a full song, But what a sound some of those old Masonite guitars with gold foil pickups have, and those tend to be pretty cheap to find used. And so we have a lot of higher end instruments too, but it's not necessarily about that. I mean, an acrylite snare that you could probably find up here for $150 all the time is just as valuable as like some A&F or Craviotto snare that's going to be over $1,000. Like, if it sounds cool and it sounds right, like, we'll use it. And so I geek out on the gear. I love the gear but I also feel like, oh man, I'd love to have 67s on overheads for this kit, but they're using our 67s in the other room. So what else do we got? And, you get something else and you just, okay, well, now that makes the snare sound a little bright. Let's get a darker snare. And I just feel like it's a mistake to get too caught up in, I can't make a good record because I don't have this or that, But yeah, all our gear, the amplifiers and the guitars and stuff are there. It's not a museum. Like, it does look very flashy. That was on purpose. Like, it was like, well, if we make it look kind of flashy, like, we'll get a lot of Instagram posts and things, and it's a little flashy for my taste, to be honest with you, but
it works.
It works, and my hope is that it's inspiring. Like, people come in and think like, oh man, I've always wanted to try this guitar, or oh, this is exciting. Like, I love these drums and whatever it is, and I'm pretty particular. In fact, I just traded like 6 pedals away last night for another guitar because I'm like, well, no one uses these pedals. So let's try to get something that people use. It's meant to not be like I said, it's not meant to be a museum. It's meant to be used and available. And every band, I mean, this last band that I was just working with, after, a few days, you kind of zero in on like, well, this is your palette for this guitar player. These guitars work the way you play. And pretty soon you're not like, let's get out 30 more guitars and try every guitar again. You go, oh, okay, this one worked really good for that kind of thing. And you kind of zero in on, I've got this Magnatone amp that, I don't know, it's some quirky little 112 Magnatone that I traded for something. And man, I mean, that amp, like, I don't know that I've ever really even seen another one, and I've certainly never heard anybody talk about it, but that amp gets used all the time. And on some bands, that just ends up being like the main amp that we use. And so it's great to have those options. It's really awesome to have like a really nice Marshall and a great Fender Deluxe and all those things that have stood the test of time and have their place. But every once in a while, you just kind of come on something that just works great.
Absolutely. Well, I think it also kind of ties back to what you said in the beginning of like, having people that are giving authentic performances and they're feeling inspired when they go into a studio. So if they have a lot of that gear that they've never seen before or never, or maybe they've wanted to try it, that kind of thing, it's going to make them more excited to perform in the studio and have fun with the instrument. And you're going to capture all of that energy in the recordings too. So,
it's like, we're constantly fighting people get nervous in a studio and the clock is ticking and we're charging them hourly for the most part, and that can make people nervous. I have a hard time. I have to remind myself that people are nervous because I'm in here every single day and I'm not nervous in here anymore. This is just where I work. But hopefully some of those things and the way we have the studio set up helps people overcome like this idea of like, this is supposed to be fun. Like, it's supposed to feel like a creative space and somewhere that you should be enjoying yourself, or sometimes not enjoying yourself if that's what we're working on. But it's supposed to be a creative place where we're making art.
For sure. Well, earlier you talked about like kind of the engineering side of things and the almost expectations of how a session should run and how you might run your process. But the same could be said for an artist coming into the studio as well. And they're going to have their own expectations of what the studio should be like and what that experience is like. And I read an article with you where you were talking about how you were talking about the roles of engineering and producing. And you had mentioned that for a lot of newer artists, there's still a lot of confusion as to like, what the differences are between those two roles and, what to expect in the studio. And I was wondering if you can like define those roles for us on the podcast and kind of give us your take on what people should be expecting when they come in.
Well, sure. I can give you my definition. I fear that I'm a little bit out of touch with what the definition of a producer even is these days.
It's so vague these days and varies by genre and everything, right?
It does, yeah. A pop producer feels like a very different thing than like a rock or alternative rock producer to me nowadays.
Or even like hip-hop producers.
Yeah, absolutely. And, in my mind, the producer's kind of the director of a movie and helping with the broader picture. In my case, that might be choosing which of our studios we're using or getting into song choice, sometimes helping write parts, rearrange parts. I know that, in many cases, a producer role involves getting really heavily into songwriting. I'm not that producer, although I do end up writing a lot of bridges for whatever reason.
It's always the bridge. Everyone gets stuck on those.
Yeah, I'm pretty good at coming up with bridges. But so the producer's overseeing things. A lot of times I work with singer-songwriters who don't have a band, so I'm helping cast the album, kind of like choose musicians that I think will get the vibe of what we're going for and also have a good relationship, get along with these people. Maybe choosing things as simple as, which things to mic up and be ready with, that kind of thing. And then as through the process, overseeing and helping guide and helping inspire or finding a good way to shut something down if it needs it. I've tried to really be active in not shutting things down certainly in a producer role. I learned from watching other producers who are better than me to say yes to almost all ideas, Sometimes if I'm also kind of in charge of making sure the budget works, saying yes to all ideas doesn't work as well, because sometimes if you are pretty sure something's not going to work, it might not be worth the time for that experiment. But I try to be open to ideas that even I might not think are going to work. And then kind of just helping all the way through. That's what I think of as the producer role. Occasionally playing a part, showing somebody a part, or communicating, but really being like artistic director in a sense. Whereas the engineering side to me is more technical, more, trying to figure out, it's like the cameraman or the director of photography maybe in a movie. Like, I'm going to try to capture this in a way that is going to serve the project and get the artists and the producer's vision of it. So often up here, if I'm producing it all, I'm almost inevitably also engineering. I do have a great assistant engineer who's really an engineer, and so when I'm producing something, I will have her come in and kind of run things for me so I can get a little bit more big picture focused. But nobody around here really has the budget for two people, so that I end up just paying for it because I think it's better for the project, in all ways. But yeah, the engineer, I think like it's mic choice and it's mic position and it's commenting on, do we have the right instrument there, and then which mic pre and which EQ, and should I compress it and should I not compress it, and should I do all the things, to kind of capture that correctly. Feels more like the engineering side, but I've seen so much blurring on all sides. The one thing that I don't really get into, which is definitely in the definition of producer these days, is really being a songwriter on things. And I just don't. I used to write songs. I just never felt like I was very good at it. So I feel like I just let somebody else handle that. So sometimes as a producer, I might call in someone to help co-write things.
Fair. Yeah, I think at that point it's just like if it's approached as like, can we co-write together? Then it like sets a different expectation, right? Whereas if it's like, hey, when you want to produce a record, then it's like distilling, like, well, what does that mean? Like, like, are we writing together? And I guess also too, it kind of brings up a question of like, how much of production should be happening before you even enter the studio? I don't know if you want to comment on that at all, but
yeah, it's a good question. My most successful a lot of it is budget, but I do like to, if there's a band that's playing and we're planning on recording songs, they have been playing and there's parts written, I like to go to rehearsals outside of the studio ahead of time. I'll just drop into band rehearsals as many times as we can figure out. And a lot of that is like working out. A lot of it tends to be like working out kick drum patterns with bass and how are these instruments working together occasionally, or, I mean, it's getting into more song structure. Like, well, you've got this 8 bars here. It's not really doing anything. Should we cut that? Or, and then, even more occasionally, like getting into like writing a chorus or, saying like, this chorus isn't really working. Can you rework that or whatever? I did just work with a band that I had done a record with. The record hasn't come out yet, but we did a record before. And what it ended up being is that they demoed things so heavily beforehand that every bit of time we had in the studio was recreating their demos. And there's a reason to do that. Hopefully we got better sounds and maybe better performances, but there were no experimentation times. There just wasn't time. Like we kept, when you're chasing like a guitar sound that was created by somebody, that takes a long time. And sometimes I remember feeling like, well, why don't we just use this guitar? We're spending so much time trying to find the right delay pedal to recreate this sound. Like, let's just use it. And they weren't really wanting to do that. They were wanting everything to be re-recorded. So we spent a lot of time re-recording their demos. So when it came time to make this new album, they said, well, we want to make another album. What should we do differently? And I said, well, it was a little hard last time because every bit of time we had in the studio was just in recreating and kind of doing detective work to try to figure out what you had done before. And some of my favorite things that happen in the studio are kind of experiments and things that come up out of nowhere that you didn't expect to happen. And so I missed those moments. And the other thing that I felt like with this particular band was that the songwriting could be better. So I said, I would advise that we don't demo anything and that we work on the songs. So we spent a year meeting together every 3 or 4 weeks, and they would just play me a new song, and I would tell them what I thought about it and maybe give them some suggestions. We did some key changes, and we mixed up some chords in places. And then they would go away, and in 3 weeks they'd come back and maybe play that song again and another new one, and we just did that over and over and over again. And then finally, when we came in, we started with these songs that we all knew the songs, but everything was brand new, And after that experience, I think there's really great things that happen, really interesting surprises. And I also know that it was kind of tough for the band because they are the type of people that like to try every option and narrow it down and fine tune it. And when you're in the studio and you're searching for we didn't have that time. So a lot of it was kind of more experiments, and there's probably a happy medium in there, but it was fun to do the other side. And I think the songwriting, the attention to detail in the songwriting certainly paid off.
For sure. Well, I would imagine too that, again, that's one of those situations where like people have a way that they're used to working. And if they've gone, if that's been their previous experiences in a studio, then that's all they know. And so to be thrown something different can throw people off sometimes. But hopefully, like I always feel like the studio is a place where like you go to work, but you also go to like learn a lot about yourself and like you learn a lot about how to experiment with your music and how to improve as a musician and all these other things that come along with like being in a studio and having an engineer or a producer there that can like help coach you through stuff. Like I feel like there's a lot to learn in the studio too. So yeah.
I mean, my most successful albums probably have been with people who are very clear about what they like and don't like, and hand in hand with really open to something new. Those are really sometimes like butt up against each other. But the way I work I feel like I'm way more interested in the performance and the energy of whatever's happening than, well, that's one idea. Let's try 30 other ideas and then we'll pick the best one. My brain, that's just not how I work. Like, if it's a good idea and it's feeling good, and I'm the same way with mixing. Like, I mix, and once it starts feeling good, I kind of just go, all right, well, this is feeling good. I don't get too in the weeds with detail, which on some mixes works out really well, and on others I think, oh, maybe I should have got into detail more on that. But yeah, this notion of like, well, I will be able to tell you when something's not right, but otherwise, let's hear what ideas we got, you know? That works really well.
Yeah, I think I'm in the same boat. Like, if something's feeling good, I'm going to let the band do their thing, and then it's going to make it their sound, as opposed to like feeling the need to like constantly provide my personal taste on their music. You know, that's not why they're hiring me most of the time, right? Like, most of the time it's just get it sounding good. We want to capture our songs that we like, you know?
Right, for sure.
Yeah. Well, speaking of mixing, I want to dig in a little bit into your mixing process, and I'm curious to know, like, how do you typically start a mix, or what do you typically listening for as you open up a new session and begin to mix?
Well, it changed. I do a fair amount of mixing projects that I didn't record. Whether that's something from around here that somebody recorded at home, or I've mixed things for artists in other parts of the world. If they send me a Pro Tools session, I will definitely listen through right where the session is and make sure I have a print of that latest, whatever they've been listening to, the latest kind of rough mix. If they send me something from Logic or something where you're kind of going to lose a lot of the levels, then I'll ask for a bounce of it, because I just want to get a sense of what things they're thinking are most important and what things, you know, I've mixed things before where the piano part was so cool, I put the piano part loud, and the guitar part I pulled back and had it kind of backwards from the artist. And sometimes they love that, and sometimes, you know, you got to go back to the drawing board a little bit. But if I'm mixing something that I've produced, there's so much mixing that goes in along the way. When I'm producing something, and I've had this happen one time, if the hard drive crashed, I want the rough mix to be what I really want it to sound like. I can't stand the idea that like we're listening to rough mixes that aren't as the record should sound. So in my mind, that mixing, I am mixing when I'm choosing the snare drum or helping choose the snare drum, or when we're auditioning guitars, and I'm thinking in terms of mix. If somebody says, should we double this guitar? I'm thinking in terms of panning, like, yes, let's double it so that on the chorus we can have something really wide. Or, you know what, let's not double that because I don't want it to be really wide here, or whatever it is, you know. I'm always thinking in terms of how it's going to play in the mix. And I have learned over the years that I have learned to value that all that time that happens. So somebody will lay down a new guitar part or a piano part or whatever it is. And usually I'll take 5 or 10 minutes at that time to kind of treat it and get it set into the mix the way I think it should sit, so that now our new rough mix, which incorporates that instrument, sounds as I would want it to sound. I've learned over time by doing it the wrong way that I need to count all those 10-minute times as mixing. What I was doing for a while is I would get to the mixing stage of an album that I produced and engineered, and then I would think, well, time to mix. And then I'd tear it all down, and I'd put up the drums, and I'd start over, and I'd overdo things because I thought, well, now I'm the mixer. And I wasn't valuing all the time we had spent up to that, getting those balances right and getting things right. And then what ended up happening is I would not like the mix as much as the rough mix, because somehow I lost that thing that we'd been fine-tuning and chipping away at. So I've learned that when I get to a mix, I'll usually listen to the rough mix on the drive in. And if I'm listening to the rough mix and I'm like, this is sounding good, then I really just try to listen, are there problems and what are they? Otherwise, I'm not going to mess with it. So sometimes those mixes on albums that are if I'm producing it and we've spent a lot of time, I would think this is the most important thing I'm mixing right now. Sometimes I spend, it's not a long mix, it's a 2 or 3 hour mix, and sometimes on something that I haven't worked on, it's a 5 or 6 hour mix. And that's me learning, like, don't touch it. Like, remember all the time you spent fine tuning it. Like, it's what you want already. And I tell artists when we get to that mixing stage, they'll say, well, should we come in for mixing? And I'm like, you're welcome to come in for mixing. It's pretty boring. And I'm not anticipating that this is going to sound all that different than a little bit clearer, a little bit more focused, hopefully more impactful version of what we've been listening to. And, at the same time, when I mix for other people, a few conversations before are very helpful to help me know what they're expecting. There's one producer around here who I've mixed a lot for, and at the beginning, I would mix something, and then he would go to a different mixer, and I would, sometimes they'd use somebody else's mixes of ones I'd done, and I was trying to figure it out a little bit because they seemed happy with it, and I was trying to, not get my ego involved as much, but say, like, what am I not doing to make this mix what you were hoping it could be? And I realized with him, he wanted me to change things. Like, he wasn't sending me a rough mix that was like, it's pretty much done, just make sure it's the right level or whatever. And if I wasn't getting into it artistically and kind of making some changes that way, I was not doing the job. Other people, if you go in and mute something in the second verse, even if I think it's better, sometimes that's pretty offensive to them, or at least they're not going to keep it that way, And that's something that I have to kind of learn about each client. But what I love in that first case is I like to mix, and I'll put up the mix and listen to it, and then I'll kind of work on the rhythm section. Sometimes I'll mute the vocals so I'm not distracted by the vocals at first, and kind of work on the rhythm section and the balance and making sure that's punching. And then I'll just kind of go through the whole session, making sure everything is sitting in its right spot, not worried so much about any automation, volume automation, but certainly like in terms of EQ and how something's sitting, that it's essentially in the right place. And then get into the vocals, get them sitting. And then when I'm working for that first producer, I will then actually take a break, a 10-minute break, a 5-minute break, and reset my brain to say, you're not mixing this anymore, you're producing it. Or you are needing to look at this artistically. And then I'll start listening to it totally in a different way, which is like, what's distracting me from the vocal here? Or what's really cool that's not coming out as much, or whatever that is. And that ends up with me muting a lot of things, taking things out, sometimes adding, like I've added made a 4/4 bar, a 6/4 bar to add some impact. Like I'll get pretty heavy into some artistic things then, because I've been given the license from him to do that. And I've made some pretty big changes on things, And usually it's been successful, and we have a relationship that I think he likes those choices that I've made. So that's really fun because it brings in a really artistic side of mixing.
I like how you brought up that idea, though, of like mixing your own recordings versus mixing for others, and like the big distinctions between them. And I agree with you. I think that like when you're mixing your own recordings, it comes back to that idea of like, you only get one first listen, right? And so when you're like in the process of recording and piecing things together, you're like, that's your first listen. You're reacting to that. You're kind of mixing as you go because you're excited by the new sounds that come through. And I totally see the merit in that. And I think that is a good way to work, so that you're not having to start from scratch with your own mixes later on. But I also think too that like when you're working with others, much like you're talking about here, it's like it's good to really understand what people want before you start doing your thing, so that first listen, you're also reacting with that goal in mind of what leeway you truly have to get that sound that they're looking for.
Yeah, people when if people are bringing in sessions, we get a lot of files from Logic, of course, and when things come in from Logic, occasionally, depending on who it is, they might bake in the volumes so that when I bring them into Pro Tools and everything's at 0, that's kind of what they were listening to, essentially. The pans might not be there, whatever. Sometimes they don't, and everything's just, the volumes that I get, I don't have any idea what their mix was. But I do get lots of questions about, should we bring this in with the reverb, without the reverb, with the delay, without the delay? And I will usually tell people, I would like to hear what you've been listening to, for sure. Lose anything on the vocal is almost always, I don't want a vocal with reverb or delay, because even if it's a very cool reverb or delay, if I compress the vocal, which I'm inevitably going to do more than you were doing, that's going to screw up the whole balance anyways. So I'll ask for certain things without the effects on. But so many times I tell them, give me everything the way you've been. If that guitar has a bunch of reverb and delay on it, let's start there. And if I'll usually have them print both versions. But I always start with the one that's kind of the treatments they've been doing. And then I'll have another folder. And if I run into something like, this is a little too this or that, I'll pull it in and we'll start over. But yeah, I don't want to dismiss all their stuff. And there's no reason for me to spend a bunch of time trying to recreate some effect on a guitar that they had that's cool, Like, if it sounds, it goes back to how's it sound, Like, I don't know, if you were using a plugin that's not as fancy as some plugin that I might have or something, that doesn't mean it's not worth keeping on there. Like, if it sounds good, it sounds good.
Absolutely. I love that. Well, one of the things that I noticed while listening to a lot of your mixes that really stood out to me was that I think you do a great job of creating separation in your mixes. Like, I feel like I can hear everything nice and clear and everything kind of lives in its own space. And I was curious to know a little bit more about your process behind that and how you go about achieving that separation. And it sounds like maybe it ties to what you said earlier about like thinking about the mix during the tracking stage, but maybe for projects that you didn't track, like, how do you approach saturation or separation there?
Sure. Yeah, it absolutely is very different if I tracked it or didn't track it. Although, I've had experience both ways in both things. But if I've tracked it, so often when we're working on parts, we'll be like, you know what, we don't need that. Or we need something to fill this hole here, And so like I said, I'm constantly thinking about the kind of frequency range, the sonic space, the panning as we're recording. For instance, I have a bunch of Rickenbacker guitars, which I find so useful in terms of recording studio. They have this kind of way of sitting in a mix that's unlike so many other guitars. They're pretty mid-rangey and they kind of slot in sometimes. So sometimes if I'm working with the band and we're like, we need a part here, but there's some big bass or sub bass or whatever, and there's lots of whatever there is. If there's only this one little spot, I will like grab a Rickenbacker, which is less a guitar. I'm not thinking of it because it's a cool looking guitar. I'm thinking of it sonically, like, oh, I know a Rickenbacker will fit right in there. Like I won't have to EQ a bunch and stuff. This Rick through that amp will fill this little spot. So if I get a mix from somebody where they haven't done that and they've stacked a bunch of things, often if it's somebody less experienced in producing or hasn't necessarily gone through and thought about those things as they're recording, there's an element to it that's just like, this has to be made less important for that to shine. Sometimes it's just, it's lovely to think that like I could EQ my way out of all these problems, and there might be people who can, like the people who do really heavy kind of rock records and make every guitar the loudest guitar you've ever heard and the vocal, and I am perplexed. I genuinely don't know how you make everything sound enormous and still hear things. For me, I think in terms of, well, like this instrument's kind of living on the right side and taking up this space, and I'm going to balance it with this instrument that's living on the left side. Or I think in terms of that often. And so when somebody hasn't done that, I usually have to do some pretty significant filtering in order to keep something. I also kind of have this mentality. I guess I think about mixing pretty visually, but I think in terms of like, well, here's this new guitar that's coming in, and I want you to hear it, but after 4 bars, it's in the way. A lot of times that happens with things that come in on like a re-intro and the verse starts and they're kind of in the way. So I think of it in terms of the camera. I'm going to point the camera on that thing, and then I'm going to point the camera away, and you'll still know that it's there. So a lot of times it's like riding, a lot of volume rides, a lot of like, hey, here's this thing, and then gently creep it back into the mix. And sometimes you can go quite far down, like you can always go 3 or 4 dB down. Sometimes you can go 10 dB down with something, and our ears kind of are okay with, I heard it and now I'm not hearing it. I remember working with watching somebody mix. I wish I could remember who it was, but they said to me, well, now's the time of the mix when I go through and give it moments. And I go through and I say, hey, listen to this. Hey, listen to that. And I'm trying to take the listener through the journey of like, here's what I want you to listen to here. Here's what I want you to see here. And so once I've done the work of EQing and things, there's a lot of that, a lot of volume ride stuff where it's like, here's a drum fill, and I'm turning the drums up pretty significantly for that fill and then pulling them back. And you'd think, well, you shouldn't do that. Drums don't change volume like that so much, but it works pretty well for me in a mix and kind of gives me the ability to say, here's this thing. And then like, that thing's going to still be there, but I don't want you to pay attention to it because you got to hear the vocal or whatever. But sometimes it's actually muting things. Sometimes it's high pass, low pass. You might have a thing where something's distorted and then you go, well, I guess I got to distort this more to make it sound intentional, or I got to figure out a way to shave all this off. And there's some creative ways to make it sound like it's somebody made the decision when something might have been just recorded poorly, I also find that I use a lot of outboard gear as I'm recording. I don't use a whole lot when I'm mixing. I'll use like a stereo EQ, a bus EQ, a bus compressor. I might mix to tape. Occasionally I'll run something through a Leslie or a tape delay, but a lot of times I'm mixing in the box, or at least in the box and stemming out to a console to do the final mixing. When I get something from somebody else and I'm struggling with something like a lot of times with the vocal, an SM7 is a great mic. And for some singers, they're lucky because the SM7 is the mic for them. But everybody's got an SM7 and sometimes it's not the mic. And sometimes when I get a vocal that's not done on the right mic, it's hard to get it to sit. And I do find, for whatever reason, that sometimes just using some outboard gear really helps. Like I said, on my own things, I kind of have done that. But when I get something from somebody to mix and I'm having problems, sometimes I bring in some outboard gear like a stay level or some of the Chandler compressors or whatever, and I will add some outboard gear, and that can kind of help get something to sit in there the way I expect it to. I don't even know if did I even answer your question? I might not have.
The question was about separation and how you go about achieving that, but I think you answered that perfectly. It's sometimes it's just a matter of, it's a matter of arrangement. It's a matter of how you're layering things during the tracking stage, and it's also a matter of how you're treating different elements against each other and creating contrasts. And so I think that example of like looking for a piece of outboard when you're feeling stuck, it's a way of giving a track different treatment so that it does stand out against everything else and it has its own thing to it, right? So yeah, I think that makes total sense.
We'd like to think that, if you want the chorus to be bigger, just add another guitar. And sometimes I'll get things and it's like the band has recorded this and they want the chorus to be bigger, and here comes 4 more guitars kind of all playing the same range. And it doesn't totally work like that. So then you kind of have to look at them and go like, well, what can I use from this guitar to add to that guitar, whatever. I was lucky enough to, be an assistant on a couple albums that Mitchell Froome produced. And he's just a genius producer. He's a genius arranger. in my experience anyways. I mean, I love his records and from what I've seen, but I remember they brought in these tapes. They were recorded somewhere else, I believe at his home studio. And so my job as the assistant was to label things and start patching and do the things the engineer wanted. So I start labeling the console. And there's all these unusual instruments. There's like dulcinea and harpsichord and all these crazy instruments that I wasn't very familiar with. And this project, in the end, the way it comes across to you is kind of a folky. It doesn't come across weird. It comes across in a palette that you're somewhat used to, but crazy impactful. And what happened is we put all the faders up, which is just kind of zero, and hit play. And this, I think, was coming off Pro Tools. But this mix, it was like, in my mind, being younger for sure, it was like practically done. It just sounded incredible. Faders up. It was so good. And I remember learning from that like he had taken these unusual instruments or I think I said the wrong word really, but a dulciola is the instrument. And he had used it. It's kind of like an auto harp, but it has keys. They were only made for a little while and they're really quirky little instruments, but you play it like a keyboard, but it has this like upper mid-rangey thing that with a little bit of distortion and stuff kind of almost sounds like an electric guitar. And he had used that on top of another guitar. And then there was a Wurlitzer underneath that. And he had arranged pop and folk instruments the way a great arranger would arrange an orchestra, where you have the cellos and the violas are not playing in the same range. They might be playing similar things, but it's all stacking up so that it goes boom and you get the full frequency range when you want it to be really big. And he had done that with all of these very unusual instruments. And it was jaw-dropping to me to just realize like, man, and a great engineer on that, but like, man, the arranging, he had mixed the record through amazing arranging,
I love that. I think that's a great example of it, though. It's like sometimes people forget that, like, yeah, if you're trying to make something dense, like it can't just be the exact same thing over and over again. Like you have to find those ways of filling out that frequency balance so that, yeah, the mix feels even, and you hear that full frequency spectrum, but also that the mix feels balanced from left to right and stuff like that. Like there's a lot of that stuff that is just, it's really important to make those decisions during the tracking stage so that you're not shooting yourself in the foot later on in the mix.
It just makes the mix so much better. And when you do it, it makes, it ends up with, if I'm mixing, it makes me look better if it's arranged really well, but it makes it so much easier. We did this last album that I was working on, a lot of acoustic guitar strumming kind of stuff, kind of an alternative rock kind of thing, but they wanted a lot of acoustic guitar, and they wanted a lot of moments where the acoustic guitar and the bass and the drums were the bulk of the band. And I've had a hard time with that in the past because sometimes acoustic guitar kind of ends up feeling like it's like a shaker with some tone in it, like it's
more of like a rhythmic thing than it is
more
totally.
of a rhythmic thing. And so I've had a hard time taking acoustic guitars and making them fill up all the frequencies that they need to be impactful occasionally in a rock kind of setting. And a couple of things that I learned, or I have learned to do over time, is one, do a number of passes. So I think we were doing, for one acoustic, what you would say is one acoustic guitar part, we were probably doing 6 different guitars. Usually we were doing 2 6-strings and then another 1 or 2 6-strings. Sometimes one of them was a nylon string, and then a baritone acoustic playing in a lower register, all just strumming. I mean, it sounds like just one massive guitar, And then I also found that like by using, I have some coil audio pre's, and if you kind of saturate those and it compresses in a lovely way and it gives it some harmonics and stuff, it just makes, suddenly you have a guitar that like can stand up to a drum kit kind of a thing, And that kind of layering and adding those things together to make one big instrument has been really eye-opening and figuring out that, like, yes, I know you want that guitar to sound like the biggest thing on earth, but I just don't know how to do that unless we expand its frequency range, and sometimes it's like a high strung on top and then some 6 strings and then a baritone underneath. And to the listener, it's like the biggest guitar, but we know that it's built from multiple pieces.
For sure. Well, I think, we talked a lot about processes. We've talked about layering and writing and arranging and all that stuff. At the end of the day, what ultimately makes a great mix in your mind?
That's a good question. I mean, ultimately, I should say that, like, a great mix highlights a great song. And I have a bit of a hard time really getting into anything that isn't like an engaging song. I remember working with the band, this is a number of years ago, when Coldplay was really big. And I remember, maybe it was Coldplay. Anyways, I remember them referencing a mix, and I listened to the mix and I thought, I'm not sure. I really like this song. This is a very popular song. I'm not sure I find this to be a great mix, whatever it was. I'm trying to remember if it was Coldplay. I think it was like off their first record or something. But I remember kind of thinking, I don't know that, like, technically this is a great mix for me, But that was interesting too, because it was still a big hit and it probably was a great mix for what it needed to be, right? It highlighted things in the way that it needed to be highlighted to get the song across. For me, I want a mix that feels like a very solid low end. I fight a lot with things getting too spiky. I think I'm personally like apt to add higher kind of 2-3K things that pile up. But I love something that's punchy and then pretty smooth. And I love the idea that you can really, in terms of a vocal, that you can get a vocal to sit and be pretty 3D. I like to feel like I have a sense of the person singing. Like, I picture it kind of visually, but I think about that vocal until it feels like it's actually someone singing in front of me, and that's when I'm satisfied with the vocal sound. I don't get too worried about, I'm pretty easygoing in terms of like which reverbs and which this and that. We used to have a couple plate reverbs and a lot of things that, are thought of by many to be essential. But I felt like, I like it. I like Valhalla reverb just as much as this plate reverb. I think we'll sell it and get a few more toys or something, I find that I can still kind of get where I need to go with pretty simple tools. In terms of like what makes a great mix, I don't know. I will tell you that the other night I drove home, made the mistake, which I know is a mistake, but I do it too much, of listening to the mix I had just finished on the way home and then getting home and being frustrated. I said to my wife, she said, how'd it go? I said, well, I don't know. I listened to the mix. I don't like it very much. And so I got to work on it more. And she said, you never like a mix. And she's right. Like I never like a mix immediately after, ever. And I don't know if that's just because I'm tired of it or what, but like if I listen to a mix on the way home, and I think I have some good ones, I don't think I've ever had one that I thought sounded good, ever. Like I'm always feeling like, I don't know how to do this. I don't know what I'm doing. And so, sometimes I get the chance to go back and readdress it and fix things. And then sometimes the next day you listen to it, you think, oh, that actually works out pretty well.
Yep. Hey, I think that's it's a refreshing thing to hear. And, a lot of people listening to this, it's like they're so in their heads about their own mixes and, they never finish things because they're just in their heads about it, right? And at some point you just got to let go and grow from that experience. And you'll often find when you listen back, you'll be like, oh, yeah, that actually did sound pretty good. So sometimes just space is needed, right?
Yeah, for sure. And there's a moment in a mix where you just start feeling like, oh, this feels cool. Like I like it. The chorus is hitting. I'm getting on the journey. I'm like interested in what's going to happen next. Again, it's that thing of moments, like thinking like okay, maybe even the instrumentation in the second verse is the same as the first verse. So as a mixer, what can I do to give the listener something new to listen to, whether that's muting something or turning something up or putting an effect on something or filtering, whatever. But that notion of like, I'm going to just like try to pull you along through this song and keep you wanting to listen. And once that's happening, I don't get too worried about like, is this the greatest snare drum sound that ever happened, Because it usually probably isn't, and I don't know how important it is.
I love it. No, I think that's a good spot to wrap up. It's just a good reminder that like at the end of the day, it's is the song moving you? Does it feel like you're growing with the song and all that stuff? And that matters way more than all of the technical nitty gritty stuff and making it technically perfect sometimes. Yeah. Scott, this has been great. I've loved learning more about your process and the way you approach things. If people want to learn more about you or maybe even work with you, like what are the best ways for them to do that?
Well, if you want to learn more about the studio, there's a site that's juneaudio.com, just June like the month. As far as working with me, you can get in touch with me through Instagram on June Audio, or I also have my own personal Instagram, which is like Scott B. Wiley or something. I am actually looking it up because I don't even know. Scott B. Wiley. And any sort of comments that way. I do really enjoy mixing stuff that other people have recorded. And for a while, I even had this little niche where I was doing a lot of bands from Singapore for whatever reason. One of the albums I did kind of blew up and I ended up getting a whole bunch of work from Singapore. And that was really fun. I love doing that remote mixing. And it's easy work because you can kind of slide it in and find time, and it usually doesn't have to, wait weeks to get it done. We offer any kind of recording really, but personally for me, I love mixing stuff that has been recorded at other places, and I certainly love producing artists.
Awesome. Well, yeah, definitely we'll include links to all that in the show notes too, so people can easily get to it. But yeah, again, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. It's been great learning more about your way of doing things, so appreciate it.
Thanks, Mike. It's awesome.
Of course. So that was my interview with Scott Wiley, and I really appreciated how that whole conversation, throughout it just kept coming back down to that core question of, does it sound good? And how that question, it needs to be a factor throughout the entire process, whether it comes down to like, the gear decisions that you're making, the production decisions that you're making, arrangement decisions, your workflow, and also just like these ideas of rules that we have in audio that we think can't be broken. If it sounds good, it is good. And however you get there, and that is really important. And yeah, I just appreciate that, because I think it is something that, as engineers, we strive to learn more tricks and techniques and learn more about all these different pieces of gear. And, we want to collect mic collection, like mic lockers that are full of stuff and, hoard a whole bunch of gear and all that. But really at the end of the day, it all distills down to that simple question. And, like you talked about, sometimes the fancy mics and the big locker of stuff doesn't even matter if at the end of the day, like a 57 does the job and it makes it sound good. So yeah, I just thought that was a great episode to bring us back to that foundational thing that all of us engineers need to consider when it comes to our productions. I also thought it was great to hear about how he treats his own projects for mixing versus projects that he's working on for other people. And I thought it was great to hear him talk about that idea of mixing as you're recording and factoring in, what is that big picture going to look like, and making sure that you've got all your bases covered there too. I think that's refreshing. And again, that also ties back to that earlier question. Does it sound good, right? And so as you're building a mix, as you're building your tracks and recording, we always need to be thinking back to that question. Now, with that said, I know from my experience talking to hundreds of musicians that idea of knowing whether something sounds good or not, for a lot of people, there's a lot of vagueness in there. There's a lot of mystery. A lot of people don't know whether their tracks sound good. And especially if you're working on your own music, it can be really hard to be objective with it and to know when a mix is done or when it needs a little bit more work. And if it does need more work, well, what do you do with it, right? And from talking to so many musicians, I know that a lot of people struggle with this. Often it's just because they're working in isolation. You don't really have anyone to bounce ideas off of, right? You can maybe ask your friends and family, what do you think of this? But they're not always going to give you the most honest answer. And even if they do, they might not be able to provide you with actionable insight into what you need to do to improve on your tracks. Now, if that sounds like you, if you feel like when you listen to your mixes, you're not quite sure what to do, you feel stuck with them, and you would love to be able to bounce your ideas off of people and get actionable feedback, have a plan for getting the sound that you hear in your head to come out of your speakers. That's what I work on with my students inside of my coaching program, Amplitude. In that program, we first figure out what it is that you want your music to sound like. We come up with that game plan for recording, editing, and mixing, and make sure that throughout the entire process, you know exactly what steps to be taking, what to be listening for, and how to get there, how to make the decisions that you need to get there. And throughout that, I'm hopping on calls with you. We're chatting back and forth. You're getting answers to make sure that as you implement it, you're doing it properly and that vision is coming to life. Now, if that sounds like you, if that's something you would find really helpful, make sure to check out MasterYourMix.com/amplitude, and you can get all the details of my program there. And on that page, there's a link where you can book a call with me. I'd love to hop on a call to learn more about the music you're making, the challenges that you're facing, and to see how I can help you. And if I can even help you at all. I only work with people in this program who I truly believe I can help. So if you're interested in getting one-on-one help, make sure to, again, visit MasterYourMix.com/amplitude, hit the button to fill out the application for the program and book a call with me. And yeah, I'd love to learn more about how I can help you. Now, with that said, we've reached the end of this episode. Thank you so much for sticking around, and I can't wait to chat with you in the next one. We'll talk soon. Take care. Thanks for listening to the Master Your Mix podcast. Please make sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app and leave a review. If you have any questions or comments for the podcast, send an email to questions@masteryourmix.com. And for more information on how to create pro recordings from your home studio, visit MasterYourMix.com.